North Korea is such a secretive nation. How do North Korean officials, in your experience, how do North Korean officials approach these sorts of talks? Can you give us some sort of insight?
Well, I think North Korea has been changing over the years very clearly. They have become much more skilled in these talks, and they have become much more adept at conveying their messages. And I think they have made clear over the past couple of years that denuclearization is on the table, which is what we heard this morning from their leader, from Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, absolutely. So much of these talks and so much of the sort of rigmarole that goes around it is about the performance. It's about the theatre of what we're seeing. Now, although we've only had one brief press appearance from the two leaders so far, what have you made of the shots that we've seen of them walking around, the arrivals and essentially the performance of the two? What do you make of that?
Well, I think they wanted to show that they have a good rapport. They wanted to show that they take this process seriously because on the part of Trump, President Trump, it has been questioned whether he actually wants to achieve peace with North Korea, who is doing this for domestic politics. But I also think that it was quite significant that the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, was willing to take questions from the press, because this is something that was not really expected yesterday. There was a speculation. And the fact that he's doing there, I think he wants to show that he's a normal leader, like the US president, like any other president, and he's willing to engage with the press. So I think he's trying to convey a different image from the one most people have, which is that North Korea is a reclusive regime with a reclusive leader that doesn't really want to engage with the outside world.
One thing I found really interesting in their press conference was Kim Jong-un saying that the two of them sat down, Trump and him, sat down together, might look like a fantasy movie. Now, that's referring, I'm assuming, to the fact that there are propaganda films in North Korea that circulate, one of which has President Obama sending former President Bill Clinton to go and meet the North Korean leader because the country is supposed to be so, the US, that is supposed to be so impressed and potentially fearful of North Korea's power. Does that give us a sense that even just being in the room there with Donald Trump is a massive win for Kim back home?
It is a massive victory for him. I completely agree with that point. We shouldn't forget, though, that his popularity ultimately is dependent on delivering economic reform, on delivering a better life for his population. So even though I think this is a very big victory, as you have just said, it is the second time they're meeting. They're probably going to be meeting more times. So the more they meet, the less people will think of this as something exceptional, and the more they will want him to deliver on the economic front, which is what he has been promising since he became leader in December of 2011.
Well, that's a really interesting point because, of course, part of what he's trying to do, as you say, is to get an easing to these US sanctions on North Korea. Now, in order to do that, Donald Trump is going to expect steps, at least, towards denuclearization. How far do you think Kim is going to be willing to go, and how far might that involve loosening his very tight grip on power in North Korea?
I think he's willing to take concrete steps towards denuclearization, maybe even including accepting international inspectors over the next few months to verify that he's actually dismantling his nuclear facilities. Having said that, this is going to be a very long-term process. If we get to complete denuclearization, and this is a big question as of today, this will take at least 10 years or so. So he has the time to accelerate, to reverse, if necessary, this process. But I do think that the image that he can simply rule the way he has been ruling, like his father and his grandfather over the last few decades, doesn't apply anymore. North Korea is becoming more marketized, the economy. People have more access to information from the outside world, from South Korea, from China as well. So I think that he actually has to deliver on his promise for economic reform. This is not something rhetorical only. And the big question is how fast he's willing to go down the route of denuclearization to get sanctions relief, to get international investment, which is one of his goals, and basically to get a more open economy. Now, with regards to social reform and political reform, I think we're very far away from seeing that in North Korea, to be honest.
Well, it's interesting that you talked about a 10-year potentially timeline for total denuclearization in North Korea. Now, if that was the case, and if Trump were to start a process of easing US sanctions, couldn't that play into Kim's hands quite nicely, in that by the end of that 10-year period, US sanctions, I mean, way before that 10-year period, US sanctions would be all but lifted?
I think that obviously, ideally for him, he would keep his nuclear program, and sanctions would be completely removed, and you would have investment, and you would have embassies in Pyongyang and Washington. That's his main goal, right? But I think this is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. I don't see the U.S. fully removing all the sanctions on North Korea unless full denuclearization has taken place down the road. But having said that, the U.S. could also go back and implement sanctions if it wanted, at least the sanctions imposed bilaterally by the U.S., maybe not UN sanctions. So in a sense, what we see here is a game of chicken, right? We're going to see who is more able to move towards his final goal, denuclearization in the case of the U.S., full relief of sanctions, and an open economy on the part of North Korea by giving as little as possible. I would say that right now it might look that North Korea is having the upper hand over President Trump, over the US, but I also think that we shouldn't forget that at the end of the day, Kim Jong-un knows that if he wants his country to be a normal member of the international community with investment that we have been talking about, he really needs to move to almost complete denuclearization, if not full denuclearization.